Evening technologies and role of energy storage in the energy system. Please take your seats, and I think I will start. So I'm the keynote speaker for today. My name is Silvia Dozzi, and I'm with ARUP, an engineering and design firm. And I was really happy to be here in this lovely city this morning, waking up and watching the sunrise from my hotel room. I realized I'm really falling in love with this city. But I'm really hoping that next time I come back to this city, I will be able to watch the sunrise and, without all the smog in the background. So I think we are all here, and so many people in this room are dedicated to that cleaner energy, cleaner Mexico and cleaner Mexico City. And I just want to have a feel for who is in the room today with us. So I'd like you to ask you to please raise your hand if you are from outside Mexico. So you are from another country and traveled so far away. Thank you very much for joining us here from such a long trip. And who is here from Mexico on the government side? Okay, quite a few people in the room. And who is here from Mexico from the private sector? I see. So it seems like, I'm not surprised actually, private sector right now is very interested in energy storage. And we do work with investors who are looking at opportunities here. So when I think about the role, it's basically a little bit about why ARUP is giving this keynote. The main reason is that 2 years ago we started a project with CENER, CFE, and CRE, and CENAS to think about the energy storage pathway forward for Mexico. And a few months ago we published our final report on what is maybe a possible path forward for Mexico for energy storage. And one thing we identified was that we focused our efforts mainly on non-pumped hydro energy storage things, because they have been around, they are mature technology already. So my presentation will be mainly about the innovative new technologies. And ARUP as a company is really seen as world leader in resilience and sustainability. And when I really had to think about what is the role of energy storage in this system, I do believe one of the most, it's not only flexibility. So when we talk about energy storage, most of the sector likes to say it gives us flexibility, but I think it gives us a lot more than that. So the two things that it can provide us is resilience and sustainability. And resilience, I really mean resilience against natural disasters, such as the recent hurricanes and earthquakes. So my team in California is involved with projects called microgrid projects, where we use energy storage as part of a smarter microgrid, which can enable basically an islanded system in natural disaster setting. I think that is a very important role. Another important role of energy storage is sustainability. And when I think of sustainability, then I go back to my dream to wake up for a very clean, smoke-free Mexico City. So emission cuts and maybe completely clean air will maybe enabled by energy storage. Why energy storage? Obviously, it's a different type of energy storage in the cars and electric vehicles, a very important topic everybody likes to talk about these days. And we do see that's one of the most important role of why we want to see energy storage. But energy storage will also enable the decommissioning of fossil fuel power plants over time. And by that I really mean not only the nuclear, similar to what Germany is doing, but the diesel generators and coal, and even with time the CCGT, the gas generators. While enabling that decommissioning, it also enables higher percentage of renewable deployment, and we will go through exactly what sort of services it provides. How does it get there? So at the very beginning of my presentation, I will really talk about very basic concepts so that everyone in the room is at the same page, and then we can continue the conversation with the panel. I will bring up two examples, one from United Kingdom and one from California, what sort of business models have been developed and what sort of policy made a big difference in those countries. So roles and uses of energy storage. The rules is really related to what service storage can provide. It can be arbitrage, it can be protection against blackouts, basically backup energy. It can help us avoid constraints and investments in transmission and distribution networks, and obviously quality control such as frequency and voltage control. But most importantly, energy storage can be deployed anywhere across the entire value chain, and I will talk about the value chain for UK and California and which part of the value chain is the most saturated with storage at the moment. But depending on where you deploy storage, it can be generation, transmission, distribution, or demand side. The value of storage, the benefits it can provide will be different, and the challenges it will be solving will be different as well. Just for example, on demand side, as I already mentioned, it can provide resiliency benefits on the top of arbitrage benefits and revenues, as well as ancillary services to the system operator. At ARUP, we created something called a 5-minute guide to energy storage technologies. This one shows different energy storage technologies in terms of device size and discharge time. Obviously, pumped hydro is an interesting example. 98% of all energy storage deployed worldwide currently is pumped hydro storage. Very old, mature technology. It is extremely large in terms of size, and it has a very, very long discharge time, which can be many hours, as opposed to lithium-ion batteries, where you can have a very small battery with a discharge time of very, very little, such as 8 to 10 minutes in a utility scale setting. And these technologies are very different in terms of maturity. So some of them are just in the research and development phase. As we work with investors and as well as governments, and investors do not really consider these new technologies yet, such as supercapacitors. Some of them at the flow batteries are at the very edge between demonstration and deployment projects. And the thing is that that's when things can really go wrong. So you would see some really exciting examples in California where flow battery investments didn't work out. So they are lagging well behind lithium-ion at the moment because of that negative perception from investors. We see quite a bit of movement and investment flowing into lithium-ion batteries, and I will show you why and how did it happen in UK and California. And obviously, pumped hydro has been around forever. Energy storage deployment will be driven by the cost reduction. So this is a chart from National Grid, United Kingdom. They looked at the cost of battery storage over time. From 2010, the prices dropped from $1,000 per kilowatt hour to about $400 per kilowatt hour in 2015. But in 2016, we already had General Motors reporting cell prices of $145 per kilowatt hour. So you can tell that there is a really wide range in terms of pricing of the lithium-ion battery technologies, and the range going forward is also large. We might see prices of $10 per kilowatt hours in 2025 and 30, but we don't know. What we know for certain that Tesla and General Motors is both targeting around $100 per kilowatt hour figures by 2020, and that will be a game changer in this sector. Basically, that's one part of the business model. So when we build up a business model, we really talk about the cost side of the battery and then the revenue side. And then additional to that, the expected return by the investors. But what we really see is that the cost is already going down, which is great news. Some value is already captured by revenues for investors, such as they can already be paid for or get contracts for shift of time use type of services or capacity and ancillary services. But I think Mexico is a very interesting example because storage investors are not yet competitive in ancillary services market. Very soon I will answer the question why. The pink box shows you the revenue stream that is already available in some of the developed markets, such as UK and California. And obviously, these developed markets still do not capture revenue streams for flexibility and avoided network investments and constraints. So there is an economic case for energy storage. Once all of these value streams will be captured in terms of revenue, this will become profitable for all investors. We are not so far away from that time. I will skip this one. I'm sorry, I just don't have enough time. We expect global deployment of modern technology, such as lithium-ion battery flow and acid technologies, over 30 gigawatt globally in 2025, going up basically virtually from zero in about 2015, except obviously for the Californian deployment. So the two best practices in the world, we think, is California and United Kingdom, and obviously Spain and Germany have been very successful as well, but we do think they provide something that other markets do not provide. So this is a very busy chart showing the entire value chain in these two countries. And what I would like to highlight that in California, about 1.8 gigawatt of deployment of energy storage by 2020 is driven by the decision of the California Energy Commission at the very top and the Public Utility Commission to require the distribution companies at the bottom, PG&E, Edison, and San Diego Electric to basically bring in energy storage investment through their tariffs. So basically, the entire energy storage deployment is funded through distribution tariffs. While in the United Kingdom, the novelty lies with National Grid, who invented a new ancillary service, which is only available for energy storage. So just a little bit more about United Kingdom. They started out, basically, they came up with a strategy. At the time I lived in the United Kingdom, the strategy emerged to be world leader in energy storage in the future, and they started out very quickly deploying pilot projects. The pilot projects were funded to the business model number 2 on this chart. So one of the funds were called low carbon network funds, available for the distribution companies. So all of those pilot projects were funded through, similarly to California, through distribution tariffs and charges. But later, they realized they have already a working market mechanism. Why don't they use the market mechanism to provide revenues for energy storage? So the way they did it was the ancillary services market product called enhanced frequency response. So this chart, the top part of the chart, shows you the frequency fault that cannot really be resolved by pumped hydro storage ancillary services, because, for example, pumped hydro storage or CCGT would only be available in about 3 to 5 minute notice, while the battery storage can be activated in 1 second. So they came up with a new product which requires 1 second activation, and this is used in cases such as that frequency fault of 14th of April 2016. This tender resulted in 243 applications from different battery energy storage projects, and 10 of them were selected. We were supporting one of these investors going through the process, and the projects will have to come online already on the 1st of March 2018. So it's a very swift process to come up with a new ancillary services product targeted only for energy storage, and bring in the investment very, very soon, in 2 years after the auction process. This is something probably Mexico could follow, and we will see if this is feasible. On the California side, I would like to just highlight that it was a legislative process. So in the middle of the chart, you see all the different regulatory decisions that came up over time. So the California Energy Commission decided to commission 1.3 gigawatt target in 2013, and they added an additional 0.5 gigawatt in 2016. So now we are looking at a higher capacity in California. And obviously, obvious question is what is the path for storage for Mexico? So this is what we thought would be feasible to look at the barriers to entry in 2017 and 80, reviewing definitions and regulation policy and current transmission distribution charges, and potentially bringing in some pilot storage projects through these distribution charges 2018 and 19, while a complete or a little bit of a new product or a complete market reform in wholesale or capacity markets may be required for next steps if Mexico would like to be in the forefront of driving energy storage in the future. Thank you very much, and I think I will continue with the panel now.
Okay. Good day, everyone. Right now, I would like to thank Sylvia for that terrific introduction to this exciting topic of storage. My name is Hector. I'm going to be the moderator today. I work for the federal government. I work at the Energy Regulatory Commission, and I'm responsible for the topics of electric reliability, power expansion planning. So I'm very related to what we're going to discuss today. I think it's that we have to acknowledge that Mexico is fully open to the dialogue about energy storage. It's so open because right now we have very ambitious targets on renewable energies in the context that we have to achieve 35% of energy penetration by 2024. And by the end of this federal administration, we have to reach 25%. So considering that, this aggressive goal, right now you can see in our expansion plans that are officially published, the consideration about energy storage devices. And you can see that mentioned in the isolated system in Baja California. So Mexico is already considering to install some storage devices for system stability, to facilitate the penetration of renewable projects, and so forth and so on. I think that we're living an exciting time right now because of the energy reform, not only because of our ambitious goals, but also because of the implementation of the wholesale electricity market. And at the end, I think everyone is entitled to try to maximize their benefit, but this cannot be done at the expense of electric reliability. And when we talk about more renewables, the need for more flexible resources to maintain reliable operation, of course, we think of storage. And as we think of storage, I think we have a great variety of options. And of course, from the federal government, we're looking for the most cost-effective option in terms of the social welfare. I mean, what's the most beneficial solution, not for the investor, not for the utility, but for the system as a whole? I think we as a regulator, particularly, we are, we have the responsibility to have the final consumer advocate. So at the end, we're looking for some technical studies, economic studies, and at the end, this whole has to come up together with a fine solution. I would like to introduce very briefly our panelists today. I think we have a great opportunity to know about their vast experience, different point of views, and first of all, we have Mr. Michael Polsky. Michael Polsky is an energy entrepreneur, founder of Invenergy. We have also Mrs. Catherine. We have Catherine Hamilton, which is the chair of the 38 North Solutions, a woman-owned public policy firm specializing in clean energy and innovation. We also have Dr. Maria Sobi from Brazil. She's an expert of hydropower plants operation and numerical modeling. So it's quite interesting to know about the experience of the largest, of the most used storage device around the world in terms of power systems. We also have Mr. Donny Holashitz, which is has consulted for startups, Fortune 500 companies, and government agencies to help them to execute innovative energy, water, and sustainability projects. We also have with us Mr. Mattis Rogner. He's a senior hydropower analyst as well, and he works at the International Hydropower Association. So I would like to start with my first question about the future of the energy storage. And I would like to ask our panelists to try to give us their perspective from two different points of view. One should be scale. I mean, when we talk about storage, we can think about small distributed storage system, or as an electrical engineer, we can think about large-scale, reliability-oriented energy devices. That should be one perspective. And the other perspective from the same question should be, what about technologies? We know about the largest hydropower dams, but also we are reading a lot about flow batteries. We are reading a lot about lithium, lithium-ion. So at the end, what's your perspective on the future from this perspective about scale and also about technology? So, Michael?
Just briefly, a company that I run, Invenergy, we are one of the largest storage operators in the United States. We have currently over 70 megawatts of storage already deployed and running, and we are in the process of adding another large amount of storage as we speak here by 2019 and 20. Let me just tell you this, that I am really a big believer in storage, particularly, with the battery storage, because the hydro storage is really historically has been done really not as a storage in a direct sense of this word. It's basically building hydro plants, which naturally you can store water and then you can discharge whenever you need. It's more of a kind of a supply option, in a classical sense. And pipe hydro storage was built primarily as an energy arbitrage facility in the system where you have off-peak power at a low cost, and then you can discharge and provide power on peak. So I think it's a completely different story, and I think with the appearance of battery type of operated storage, we clearly in a completely new game here, where we can really deploy storage on the increments that we want. Pump hydro, you have to build where you can build, and it has to be scaled. Same with the hydro plants. With a battery type of storage, we can build whatever we can, and we can really provide different products into the system. One thing I just want to mention here, what you mentioned is that certainly you're responsible for optimizing storage for the public good, and I think if in Mexico it's really the case, you would already deploy storage, because there are a number of systems, particularly in Baja California, where you waste, or Mexican waste, tens of millions of dollars already by not deploying storage. So I think the faster, the better situation is. But one thing I just want to say, that storage has a great future, but I want to emphasize the fact that storage does not have natural entry to the market. In other words, you can't just build a storage, except arbitrage, and say, you know what, I'm just going to build a storage and somehow I'm going to make money. You have to have appropriate government policies to support storage. In other words, you have to have a system that storage facilities are being paid for the service they provide. If the currently designed markets anywhere in the world, they're really not capable of remunerating storage service. So the key is to provide with appropriate policy where storage is really receive appropriate value for the service that they provide. I can certainly have a whole dissertation here, but I'm just going to pass into the next person here.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear okay? Okay. I've been working on storage since the late 1980s, when I was a distribution designer for grids, and we had a 2,000 megawatt pumped hydro plant backing up our nuclear plant. And then we also sold ice storage, thermal storage, to large commercial customers to deal with growing demand, growing peak demands, and the inability to build out feeders fast enough. Now storage is in a completely different place. And people talk about storage being the holy grail. Well, they never found the holy grail. So I think of it as the bacon for the grid, because bacon really makes everything taste better, and energy storage really just makes everything better on the grid. So I think what we're going to see in the future is all types of applications. You're going to see large-scale, grid-scale applications. You're going to see commercial and industrial customers already installing storage. You're going to see community-based storage and microgrids. You'll see behind the meter for residential customers. It will depend so much on the policies, on the government leadership, and also on the attributes that we want our grid to have. So I would guess that most developers, when we look at, and you would ask us to look at technologies, don't say, I want this particular technology. They say, I need this attribute. I need this characteristic to support the grid, or to support my project, or to help me reduce my bills. And that's what they're looking for. So I think in addition to having storage in all places on the grid, I think we'll also have all types of technologies being able to participate, and we have room for all these technologies. So we have room for very high-speed flywheels or batteries. We also have room for flow batteries or pumped hydro. I just think it will completely depend on what we need on the grid, and also what the policies and leadership are.
Hi. Yeah, in addition to what my colleagues have mentioned, I think when we think of storage, we're thinking of the capacity of saving some energy to be used when necessary, either to compensate intermittency of renewable energies that are increasing in all markets, or for compensating seasonal problems that you have, if you have rain or you don't have rain, for example, and also for daily shifting. No? And in terms of space for all kinds of technologies, I think there are different demands, and the different technology will supply the necessity. In terms of, even though pumped hydroelectric storage is a mature technology, we still have some developments. As Michael mentioned, in principle, it was most of the pumped storage, hydroelectric power plant storage, they were built as a normal, regular hydropower, and naturally it could be also a storage space, so we built pump turbines. But now we already have different concepts, such as a ternary concept, where you have a pump and turbine, and this allows you to change from one type to operation to another one, instead of in 1 or 2 minutes, in 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And we also start to think, and we have been working on projects, how to use these with the renewable energies in distributed ways. So how to use, for example, salt water and have a hydro storage power plant coupled with a solar power plant. So I think the more we try to reduce the use of thermal power plants and increase the use of renewable power plants, the more we will need storage alternatives. And of course, as they both mentioned, how to value these storage supplies in the grid has to be really evaluated, because just the costs are quite high, and you have to really understand what's the bacon and how the bacon really helps everything else in order to properly evaluate the value of a storage.
One of the questions was, do we see a world where everything is going to be distributed in terms of storage, or do we see a world where there might be just one battery? Like we can call the battery the Megatron 2000 battery that we installed for the whole system. That's what we're talking about. The world is going to be somewhere in between, and what I want to touch upon is what I think are going to be some of the key drivers that are going to create opportunities in shaping that world. The first driver, and a very important driver, is the distribution and the transmission system and the state of that distribution and transmission system. So in a world where you have unlimited transmission and distribution, do you need batteries for distribution deferral? Do you need batteries for transmission deferral? You can basically have, if you have no limits on transmission and distribution, you can install the one battery called the Megatron 2000 and essentially share that amongst the whole system to create the most system benefit. So you will not have any constraints on, for example, transmission constraints. So your reserves, you won't need to have different reserves in different zones because you will not have any transmission constraints. Your frequency regulation you can do from that particular location. If there's a consumer that has a peak load and wants to shave it, since there's no transmission and distribution constraints, they could rent the Megatron 2000 battery and they can shave their peak because there's no constraints associated with that. But in a world where there is transmission and distribution constraints, what starts happening? Well, there's opportunities to install batteries, to do distribution and transmission deferrals. You basically have different reserve zones form, and so you have batteries that could provide a service, different types of services in the different zones that form within the system. Your voltage control is different in different locations depending on where you are. So the benefit in a world where the social benefit in a world where there is transmission and distribution constraints will depend and will create opportunities for distributed batteries. Those batteries do not necessarily have to be owned by somebody. They can be shared, right? Just like you could do it in a world where there's one big battery, you can share that battery. And if you look at other industries that have gone through similar processes, for example, the information storage industry, you can look at earlier when there was no internet, where was storage, information storage? It was all distributed, right? Where the computation was happening. There was no way to share information. There wasn't a grid that was sharing information. What happened when all of a sudden you have ubiquitous information sharing amongst anybody in the world? Well, you've got a bunch of companies that are coming around and building business models to share their data centers. They're building smaller assets. Everybody with information is able to share that infrastructure. So I think, in a sense, a big driver is going to be what's the state of the transmission and distribution system. That's going to create big opportunities for the different types of batteries that are going to be needed, and there's definitely going to be a shared model. The other factor that is going to be very important has nothing to do with system benefit. It has nothing to do with system benefit. It has more to do with co-benefits. And what do I mean with those co-benefits and co-problems? Tell, for example, a production facility that produces a widget or sells $1 million in widgets, every day, or whatever, or a big amount of money, and electricity is 5 to 10% of their bill. Do they really care about system benefit to having a battery solution that creates system benefit? No, they're going to install a battery perhaps because they want to make their process more reliable. They want to make sure that they can keep producing the widgets that they will sell for $1 million every day. And if they're spending $10,000, $20,000 on energy, they're really battery to them is going to be more not about the system benefit, but it's going to be more about how does it make my process more reliable, essentially. So those co-benefits and co-problems that are created on the demand side are also going to drive the need for batteries and how batteries might be distributed.
Thanks. So from the International Hydropower Association, so from the hydropower's perspective, we do definitely believe that there's going to be a wide mix of various different energy storage technologies. But from the role of the perspective of pump storage, as was already said, currently is 98% of energy storage, which amounts to around 150 gigawatts worldwide. And that is going to continue to grow. In China alone, they've already are going to construct something about 60 gigawatts, start construction on 60 gigawatts of pump storage in the next 5 years, with the goal of reaching 40 gigawatts by 2020 and 90 gigawatts by 2025. Pump storage developments are also happening all over the world, also in countries that are not so traditionally involved with pump storage, such as in Indonesia, in United Arab Emirates, in Israel, and other countries. That being said, pump storage is also continuing to evolve and to innovate. As pump storage was, as Michael said, was originally constructed to balance sort of the baseload nuclear and coal power. Now with more variable renewables, you see even the older pump storage stations adapting and innovating in their operations, such as there's a hydropower station or a pump storage station in Scotland that went from traditionally 2 cycles a day, just sort of your daytime, nighttime peaks. That's now cycling about 60 times in a single day to balance off the wind. Furthermore, like, as Maria mentioned, we're innovating to install sort of variable speed technology into the variable speed pump turbines, which can assist with frequency control. And we're also developing smaller pump storage projects, such as very, very small, sort of 11, 10 megawatt projects that can be used on islands, as an example in the Canary Islands, which is being coupled with wind. And another innovation where they're coupling the pump storage upper and lower reservoirs directly with wind turbines in Germany.
I love Catherine's analogy of the bacon, and sometimes I feel like the whole pig, probably, because I've been around the entire sector only for 11 years though, but on the regulatory side, from the utility side, and now working with the private investors. And if I really have to think about large scale or small scale, I think it has to be both, because what we see in California today is to meet resiliency targets and make sure the system is reliable in a system stress situation. There are many microgrid projects around hospitals, airports. Some of them are not small, actually, but I consider them small because they are on the demand side, right? But then we see the large-scale projects as well. Pumped hydro was also greenfield ones in California, and obviously, the large scale for a lithium-ion battery, I think, is around 100 megawatt scale now, the largest one deployed in San Diego recently. So I think those ones are happening at the same time. So I think it's a really great progress going on today.
Okay. I'm taking notes, and I have identified that you have common thoughts on certain aspects from storage. But right now, I would like to refer to penetration of renewable energies. I mean, we're talking a lot about targets, some deadlines. Here in Mexico, we have a national target. Unlike the US, for example, which is more familiar, they have state targets, which are called a RPS. But right now, I would like to ask, what do you see the role of energy storage in the flexibility of the system? I mean, we have certain concerns about primary frequency response, as we see the share of renewables growing in the system. We have some concerns about having these essential reliability services defined by NERC for the future. And on the other hand, we have also seen that in some power systems which already have 20% of penetration of renewables, perhaps energy storage are not that deployed as we may think. So this could be also related to interseasonal challenge to the current technologies. So I would like to leave that question for you, talking about renewables, flexibility, penetration, reliable operation. So I think it's quite a mix of topics for the same questions.
Yeah, there are places already in the United States, for example, where there is a penetration over 20%, and sometimes I think Germany has higher penetration. I don't think you need storage to meet in Mexico 35% renewable target. Okay, you can do it by doing other things. The question is, what's the best way to do it and derive additional benefits? So storage is not a must-have technology. unless maybe some very unique situation, you have number of other generators in the system. You can do other things to balance the system. The question is, what's the most economical way? What's probably the cleanest way? What is sort of makes sense way? What is the easiest way, if I will? The advantage, the advantage of storage, particularly battery storage, is the simplicity. I always like the simplicity. No moving parts. You don't have to build dams. You don't have to do anything, okay? So the question is, at what cost do we want to achieve results we want, okay? And that's where the policy comes in and basically says, here's the result we want to achieve, and who can provide us lowest cost solution, okay? But like I said, this solution could be done with existing power plants. You can build diesel generators and do things. So the point is, because we simply have renewable target, in my view, it creates an opportunity for other type of products to solve the issue, okay? Such as for example, battery storage, okay? You can derive additional benefits with storage, in addition to not just primary frequency, but you can, with a large penetration of renewables, okay, you can create, there are sort of duck curves, what you see in California, the other things that you can have, and as cost of batteries will go down, okay, you can create additional benefits, such as eliminating the duck curves, okay, shifting power on a large scale. We will see more and more benefits, okay? So it could be bacon, it could be other things, but I think we should not rush to simply say, let's put batteries because everybody else put batteries. We have to see what's the most economical solution. My personal belief is that we're still long time away from using batteries for large amount of energy store and shift. Okay, it's primarily for primary frequency, for voltage support, for unique solutions like Baja, where you can provide peaking, even service with the batteries and things like that. But it's not one glove fits all solution in some ways. But my encouragement to you as a government regulator is to enable batteries or different storage technologies compete for the service you provide. You should assume that every service has a cost to it, and you got to identify and say, what, here's what we're dealing with. But I do believe. Let me tell you also just quickly on the distributed storage. Again, we have to be also careful to think that everybody's in their home will kind of put storage. I think it's sort of far-fetched. Again, people look at the simplicity. People, in my view, we're still long-term away until people kind of try to use their home as a sort of power plant and a storage device. I think some people that sort of like to play with this, they may, but I think plus distributed storage, and we can see with solar, for example, if you put solar on the roof, it costs multiple times of cost of the central build storage, solar. So I think that's something that we have to watch and see how it's going to develop.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with Michael on a lot of those points. Yesterday, the Brattle Group issued a report called Stacked Benefits, Comprehensively Valuing Battery Storage in California. Now, also keep in mind, not everything is California. California is like the gold rush place for storage, but that is not the case everywhere else. But just looking at California, part of what they found was, rather than just looking at individual use cases, because there are a lot of different things that storage can do, part of which is to help the integration of renewables, is how do you really stack those values? How do you create policies and the ability to really participate in a number of different markets at once? So they found that the highest values were arbitrage, which Michael mentioned too, frequency regulation and capacity, and all of those do help integrate renewables. Those are all, if you can stack those values and be compensated for those values, that will allow you to compete But there are also things that we would need to build in, like resilience. What's the actual value of resilience? What's the value of low emission? So what are the goals that your country or state wants, and make those into real values that you build into the cost of what is your system going to look like? And maybe it looks a lot of different ways. Maybe it has demand response and efficiency in addition to some storage and renewables. So there are a lot of different technologies that can bring this. But I would say just from a really practical standpoint, when you look at the penetration of renewables, and I will use California as this because we recently had a solar eclipse, and about 5,000 megawatts of solar dropped offline all at once, and there was hydro available to bring in from the Northeast. But we were able to manage the grid in California because of energy storage, because of demand response and other programs that were there that were able to use to manage a large grid. But I think part of the issue is really, how do we stack those values? How do we allow us to really take advantage of all of the different things that these technologies allow you to do, all of the characteristics, and not just look at one thing. Don't just look at how do I make sure that I get enough renewables on, but how this is a real system issue.
Well, I don't have much to add what has been said, to be honest. I totally agree with Michael and Catherine. And I think storage is one of the tools we have to plan the future, to plan the energy supply. And it has to be evaluated with global targets in terms of environment, technology development, and society welfare. And it's important while evaluating all these things, to take into account the real value of storage and how it has impact in other benefits, and in order to try to, and how you expect the market to grow, the demand to grow, and where these demands will come of energy, and to take all this into account and have a long-term planning. So this tool of storage can be also taken into account.
Yeah, I wanted to take on 2 points that Michael and Catherine said and complement that. I think when you think about storage, you have to think, and like Michael said, I mean, you cannot think about storage without thinking about your transmission and distribution system and the current assets that you have installed in the system. So for example, let's take, I work a lot in the Chilean power market. Let's take Chile, for example. Chile it's getting to integrating 10% of renewables this year. Essentially, it's not interconnected to other systems. It's a very long transmission system, very constrained. The demand centers are far away from where energy is being generated. So it doesn't have access to a lot of the flexibility that these other markets have been having access to. For example, Denmark, which is integrated 45% of renewables, essentially, but it's connected to Norway, and so uses all the dams in Norway and complements, and it's connected to Europe, so it can use that flexibility. So essentially, the need for storage is really contextualized upon what are sort of the dynamics that are being created in the market based on the current assets that you have, and how the renewable energy integration is creating problems. But for example, in Chile, you don't have access. It's a constrained transmission system. You've integrated a lot of renewables, but you do have a lot of hydroelectricity. So what's happening when you forecast or look at what could happen in the market when you integrate more renewables? Well, those ramps that you see whenever the solar production comes down, well, hydroelectricity is super competitive at taking those ramps. It's hard to make a business case to say that you will beat hydroelectricity with storage or something else. Even with flexible gas motors, it's harder to make a case for that. So really, the needs for storage really depend on the current situation of the market. Another very important factor that Catherine touched upon, and that's happening in a lot of markets, and we're seeing in Chile, we're seeing in Ontario, we're seeing in other markets that have integrated a lot of renewables, is there's certain times of the day when adding 1 megawatt of renewable energy does not actually help your carbon emission mitigation goals. It basically doesn't do anything for you. When does that happen? For example, when you curtail energy, adding a megawatt hour doesn't do anything for you in terms of your emission goals. And there's other restrictions that are happening where you have difficult situations in terms of the operations of the system. So those goals are also becoming quite important. So basically, if you want to meet your goals, you want to integrate renewables, and you put certain prices on carbon and certain things on environmental constraints and commitments that you have made, then that does have an effect on what technologies you use for flexibility. Do you use a coal plant that's cycling the whole time? Is that what you want to use? Or do you want to use gas motors? Or do you want to use storage? So that's also a big factor that's driving how storage and the value of storage in the system.
I'd like to maybe just add another example from instead of Chile, just to use China as an example. So there's a lot of various different opportunities or choices to use to integrate variable renewables, demand side management, supply side management, storage, and transmission and distribution lines. So in the case of China, where there's a huge capacity or a huge potential for variable renewables of wind and solar in the north and the west, which are far away from their demand centers in Shanghai and Beijing, Hong Kong. One of the ways that they have to move that renewable electricity from the far off provinces, and they're developing the high voltage direct high HVDC lines, and energy storage in those kind of cases can work together. So you can use energy storage and transmission lines to increase the efficiency of the transmission line to lower that investment cost. So by installing the pump storage, or any storage for that matter, near or either at the source where the renewable energy is being constructed, being developed, or at the demand center, you can pretty much make sure that those transmission lines are basically being used as efficiently as possible, and therefore also sort of reducing their investment costs.
And adding to another example, just we have been around the world, the United Kingdom is next, I think, because they used to think they have time to deploy battery storage, right? They were on the path from 15% to 30% penetration of renewables. But what happened over time was that frequency faults has become more frequent and also more serious. And at some point in April 2016, it was a frequency fault which could not be solved by pumped hydro storage, because pumped hydro storage is basically not as quick in terms of reaction, but renewables are really quickly dropping off the system. They don't have the time, slowly dropping off, similarly to the CCGT or a hydropower plant. So I think that's the thing, that's the value that battery storage can provide, and the traditional electricity markets and systems are not providing any revenue streams for this additional really fast response, which, as I mentioned, could be within 1 second, as opposed to 2 to 3 minutes of the conventional competitors. So I do believe the only thing who could compete with battery storage in the United Kingdom for this service was interconnectors, the one you mentioned. So they are building interconnectors, for example, to Norway. And interconnector could be quick, but there is AC/DC conversion there, so also a little bit more problematic than battery. So I do believe in battery, and I think they have a future in the system. The question is it required in the current Mexico energy system or not?
Okay. Right now, it's quite interesting just to listen to all of you guys. And I have identified that you have repeated a key word in your answers: policy. And I think that should be my final question. And I'm particularly interested in your answer because as a regulator, we are particularly concerned about fairness, rules, certainty, and those words are not easy to define. For example, I totally agree with Michael and also Catherine saying, perhaps we don't want to encourage a specific type of technology for energy storage. Rather, we would like to define what's the need of the system and let the technologies compete. So at the end, what's the best way? Technology, storage to solve the problem? Okay. Or maybe not. Perhaps a diesel generator, or perhaps another dam of the hydropower plant. So how can you propose that policymakers and regulators make sure that all benefits are properly identified for non-monetized benefit? For example, here in Mexico, we have defined as a part of the reliability policy, we have defined the value of the not served energy, which is around 2.6 US dollars per every kilowatt hour that is not served, which is quite high. So I think what I'm comparing, the value of the energy storage against the value of not having energy, or should we run a cost-benefit analysis as business as usual, analysis of the production cost with and without the energy storage? So that's kind of the concerns we have right now about policy. And also I would like to add another point to the question. In terms of environmental impact, is there any concern you have from this particular point in which environment should be a concern also for the energy storage devices deployment? Michael?
Yeah, I said before that policy is a fundamental for deployment, because market by itself, like I said, you just mentioned that market for called decremental energy, but market cannot value this. I mean, you have to have a policy to value this, and then people will come up with a solution. But a couple of things about this. I agree with you, that if you start picking technologies, it could be difficult. I do believe at the end of the day that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that what makes sense and what eventually would win. And so, but you have to also make sure that you not study this policies for so long that you not do any policy, so I think on Baja you already studying it for years and nothing has happened. So I think, but I do agree that you not necessarily, you have to determine what solution you have to find, whether it's a frequency regulation, voltage control, some other attributes on the market, okay? And then you let people supply those attributes, okay? Now, last point on environment, that's another policy. Is there policy of Mexico reduce carbon emissions or not? So if diesel generators supply frequency regulation, then they have to pay some sort of a penalty for that because it's environmentally not plausible solution, okay? So that could be all blended in, but my recommendation is not to wait for the perfect policy. Maybe initial policy, maybe not perfect, but then you refine as you go, rather than you wait for a perfect policy and nothing will happen for years.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there are different pieces of policy. The first is planning, and our planning systems now are set up to plan for traditional generation and big wires, okay? So our planning isn't designed to think about non-wires alternatives, like what other kinds of things do we need to build in, what do we really need? So I think we have to change our planning system, whether it's on a national level or a state level, really develop those plans. Secondly, figure out how do we allow people to compete based on what we need for those plans? How do we set up a real competition? And then finally, how do we compensate for the values that all of those services are providing? And I'll give a couple of examples. On our federal side, our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did an order a couple of years ago to a rule to allow for compensation for speed and accuracy for frequency regulation, okay? Because speed and accuracy are really, really important and they had a very high value. That rule alone, and they didn't specify technology, but flywheels and batteries are particularly good at that. So that really opened up the market by allowing those attributes to be compensated at the value that they were worth to the grid. A couple of other examples. California did a mandate. So a mandate isn't really, that's like, we want to make sure that we get this going. We're going to jumpstart it. We're going to just at least create the environment and an ecosystem, and it did. Hundreds of companies went to California to start building storage. But what they did then was each utility had a competition and put out an RFP and said, bring us whatever you have. And they were oversubscribed with all of the different technologies and applications that came to the table. And then finally, for compensation, another example that's not in California is in New York State, which was they have a new regulatory process. They're deregulated, and they basically said our distribution system is a platform. And this platform, anybody can compete on this platform. You bring your technologies, and what that has done is opened up all of these interesting third-party applications. There's a microgrid with a blockchain, with storage. There are all kinds of new things coming to the front because they've created the regulatory environment that allows people to come in and compete and then get compensation for what the services are that they're going to be able to provide. So I think that's all really important when we think about the policies.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy task. I'm not an expert on the topic, but definitely there are things that are a lot easier to be quantified, such as frequency stability and how a certain source would increase it or decrease it. But there are also topics which are definitely difficult to qualify and even more difficult to quantify, such as environment. And I think this has to be discussed with society and within the state, and define targets, define priorities, and maybe build different scenarios and compare them in terms of benefits and issues, and try to define a strategy.
So you got a difficult job, but I think there's hope. I think one thing that's very important is to separate the problem into two things, and one thing is solving shorter term problems in the system. And so essentially you've got a system that's operating. For example, Baja California. You've got Baja California. Baja California is facing challenges in terms of operations. And it has a certain generation capacity. So solving those issues that emerge and creating opportunities for technologies to come in and solve those issues. If you're having issues with frequency regulation, then you need to. It's about identifying those needs in the market and trying to figure out how those needs could be satisfied. And one of those options might be storage. Then there's another part of it which has to do with longer term planning. And in that longer term planning, it's quite harder to do, but you definitely have to start building some scenarios of where you want to be in the future. And you have to say, hey, I find it really important that by 2035, we're going to meet these CO2 emission goals. We really, in Mexico, we want to promote these types of technologies or these types of industry. Nobody likes to talk about industrial policy, but a lot of these incentives that are being created in other markets do have in the background a little bit to do with industrial policy. You see California doing a lot of stuff. They do a lot of stuff because they have problems, but they also want to lead in terms of technology development, and they want to use their market in terms of being able to experiment with different things. So essentially, in the longer term, it's a more complicated issue to solve, and you're not going to get the formula right, essentially, but you're going to have to make some choices of where you want to be in the future and how you get there in the future. But in the shorter term, I think you have the opportunity to solve some of the issues and actually create some services or some remuneration that solve some of the challenges, and that might actually happen through storage. I think in any sort of, if you think from an investor's perspective, if you are looking at investing in storage, if your business model depends on regulation and then uncertainty with the regulation, or you have to do something where you're going to be remunerated based on a regulation that doesn't exist or isn't there, it's very unlikely that people are gonna invest. So you have to take some plunges and basically say, do I want people investing? So I have to define a problem that I'm trying to solve. I'm trying to do something, do a challenge in the short term, and then you also might do some planning in the future of where you want to be.
I guess I'll just jump back onto the sort of the long-term perspective that Donnie was speaking about. We'd probably hope that policies should also look at sort of the long-term system benefits and the value of energy storage for that system. And then I guess when you're looking at these system benefits or the system values, where do you actually draw the system boundaries in this case? So if you want to talk about decarbonization, you should have policies in place that will ensure that a flexible generation system with also a decarbonized electric power system. But then I guess just to be a one-trick pony about hydropower. Hydropower exists not only within the power system, not only within the energy system. Hydropower is also a water regulation. It also deals with the water system. And I was speaking to a South African friend yesterday at dinner, and he reminded me that South African pump storage, the one it's located in the highlands near Lesotho, a lot of that pump storage is also delivering water to Johannesburg and to the South African demand centers, where they rely on the water services that pump storage can also bring. So when you're thinking of these long-term benefits, you need to also take into account sort of also the lifetimes of these projects, and not only where do you draw the system boundaries, but also the lifetimes of these projects. Pump storage projects pretty much can be lasting for 50, 60, 100, 150 years. There's not that many pump storage projects that have been decommissioned because they're too old. If they have been decommissioned or they're being put into transitional operational phase, it's been because of a market failure. So yes, I agree with the sort of the long-term policy benefits, but we got to think of where those boundaries of the system is.
Yeah, so I'd like to bring in the investor perspective, because as I traveled around and met some investors on my trip into Mexico City this time, what they told me was that, I asked them really what do they perceive as energy storage policy in Mexico, and they told me that what they realized that for sure energy storage is a very low priority. So if that is a perception of investors, that's my first question, is this the message you are trying to convey to the investor community? And then as opposed to energy storage, where is then the policy focus right now? It seems to be on transmission. So when there is an electricity system problem, the government or the policy currently seems to be that it's solved through transmission lines. The only question with transmission lines is that they are long-term investments. They will be there for 40, 50 years time, and they are a relatively large amount of investment, as opposed to maybe starting up with a smaller scale policy target for energy storage. It could be even a 1 gigawatt target where flexibility is around, because those investments will only be around for 5 to 10 years, and then there is another other type of investment. So I think the clarity of what is really the very, where is it, how important is energy storage, just very basic first step would be very, very helpful. And then from that, probably, as Michael mentioned, setting a target, a quantified target, and moving on from there.
Do you have a specific question, Catherine, for just 1 minute?
Ask about environmental issues, and I forgot to mention about recycling. So we're going to have this problem, not today, but in 5 or 10 years with the number of EVs, electronics, and battery storage that's out there. And I think the EU is already thinking about this circular economy and making sure that critical materials are recycled from batteries, but that was part of your question, and none of us had addressed it. Sorry.
Okay, so I think this has been a terrific round of answers. And right now, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Please, could you introduce yourself and be very concise on your question, please? Is there any question?
Paola del Rio, Meridian Carbon. This question is for you. How is storage considered in Mexican regulation right now?
Okay. Um, well, right now, energy storage is already considered within the regulation for the Mexican sector. The regulatory framework already states that these devices have to register as a generator, and they can participate in the whole mechanisms available right now, for example, auctions, and they can offer whatever products they are able to provide. And they have to present also offers from a generator perspective. For example, I'm going to sell certain amount of energy or sell certain amount of ancillary services. As well, they can offer, present the same offers as a load. So I'm going to consume certain amount of energy, and there's some space in the market rules in which opens the possibility for energy storage devices to be part of the transmission network. But right there, we have to look for effective legal separation. But of course, right now, there's the general context for energy storage devices to participate. They have to register as generators. They can provide whatever, they can offer to provide whatever they can. But I acknowledge as well that perhaps there's a lack of more specific or detailed rules, perhaps in the future with some manual or some specific guidelines, rules, or regulation. But we want to make sure that whatever we're going to write, whatever we're going to issue, we're considering all these aspects that our panelists have just mentioned. That should be general. Is there any?
In other places, and actually it's interesting looking at the Mexican market law, and I don't know how you call it in English, las bases del mercado eléctrico, okay. But what's nice is that actually storage is defined in the law. So what needs to happen is you need to take it to the rule level, essentially, and that's what a lot of the work that's being done now is being taken to the rule level. Essentially, like you mentioned, there's some important aspects in how you operate and the principles on how you operate. It is important that there's two business models for somebody that wants to participate in the Mexican market. One is to be sort of like a generator, and essentially you can participate same as you would buy demand. You know, you would buy energy and you would sell energy, and you would have similar rights as a generator. But then you can also, there's another business model where you actually get installed in the transmission distribution system and you're separate from generation, and there, according to the law, you will get paid based on tariffs, essentially, and those tariffs will be defined. So, yeah.
I just want to add to that, this is a classical example of a bad policy because, you know, battery is not a generator. I mean, you know, with this policy, there would be no batteries built in Mexico ever, you know. So, you know, this is the whole point here. I mean, they defined as a generator, but it's not really a generator in the classical sense. You can call it, or it's not a load. It's a combination of both, and they have to provide, you know, completely different products. So that's the thing, you know. You go to regulator and said, okay, yeah, fine, you register a generator, but, you know, this is just not a policy that we can call it policy. It's sort of write something in just to write something in.
I completely agree with that, and this is what I was trying to highlight in the UK. What made a difference, because until batteries competed with everything else, there was no bidding into that ancillary services market from storage. But once there was a tailored product for directly the services that they can provide best, which is a speedy service, there were 243 projects coming online. So, you know, it's a very small shift, and it can bring a very big difference.
Is there any question?
Thank you very much. Tatsuo Masa from Japan. I'm an MBA professor. And this is an enormous learning opportunity. Thank you very much. My question is going to the keynote speaker. You talked about many things about batteries and business models and technological innovations and all these things. But my question is about material to be used for battery. Lithium-ion battery seems to be most efficient and highest energy density, and that's small power, but it's very expensive. To make it battery more readily available, can you think of any material that can replace lithium and cheaper but equally efficient, kind of dream material? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm an economist and not an engineer, unfortunately, but what I understand that Japan is really leading the innovation of the flow batteries, and there is a potential there, but as I mentioned, just because of some negative investment examples in the past, it is facing some challenges compared to lithium-ion batteries. I think all the technologies will compete on a level playing field, but they will be able to provide different services and they will be competitive in different markets over time. So I don't know if we have an engineer on the panel who can answer the question, but I think for now, in terms of environment, our focus is our atmosphere and try to stop greenhouse gas emissions. So we stop thinking about how environmentally harmful maybe solar PVs are or batteries are, and we will at some point be flooded with them. So that is a concern, but right now it's just not the first priority.
Okay, Roland Dordijn from Siemens. Seeing that in California the first hybrid plant was installed, or it's being constructed, so it's a gas turbine with a battery, and looking, let's say, thinking about needs and regulatory frameworks, how do you guys see the potential for gas turbine battery-based hybrid plants?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the need, I mean, I think again, that goes a lot to essentially you have to look at California, and it's different in terms of their generation base. For example, here in Mexico, there's about 15% hydroelectricity coming from dams and hydroelectric projects. So essentially, those dams could potentially provide some of those ramping services, essentially. So if essentially part of the value that they create is that with that technology, you have a rapid ramping that you can do with that hybrid solution, essentially. And so in Chile, for example, you also have a lot of hydroelectricity, and that's the case in a lot of markets in Latin America. You look at Colombia, you look at Costa Rica. I mean, so essentially you're going to have to, on a cost basis, if you want to take on those ramps, compete or be able to differentiate in terms of maybe speed or what you're able to do in terms of that. So in terms of market needs, that's something important to consider here in Mexico and hydro and other Latin American markets.
I just want to add, it's a particular, solution. If this particular gas turbine generator wants to create additional revenue for quick start or for immediate response, they just put a battery. But again, it's an individual solution in a particular case. And again, same could be done here. If it would be, in the Mexican market, you'd be paid as a peaking plant, and you want to create additional revenue. You understand, co-location make a lot of sense from the standpoint interconnection, operations, things like that. So people co-locate things, not because it simply make economic sense. So that's the reason, particular project in California.
Yeah, I like your point saying hybrid technology, because I think another name for this would be potentially the microgrids that I mentioned, and which not necessarily are micro. So you might be speaking of 10 to 20 megawatt of storage there, aligned with solar PV and also CCGTs. So we see them happening, and they are also happening in California, because that side of the market is not supported by the policy as much as it should be. So they can access some of the grants for storage, but then create a much better solution which will provide resilience in any situation. And this is also public side. So private investors are still not confident that that model is commercially necessarily feasible. Where is your project based, the one you mentioned?
Thinking what is bad, we treat the batteries as a generator. We can use two different points to locate the battery storage. In the utility side, or associated directly with some type of plants. And there are different type of auxiliary services. But if the auxiliary service are directly related with the renewable penetration, then maybe one way is to ask these solar and aeolic plants to have some minimum capacity and minimum ramping capacity. Then their plants will add the needed storage, if that is the main auxiliary service that we are looking for. What do you think about that approach? To put the storage directly with those plants or move it to the utility side?
I think California already has something similar, that they need to meet all of the different generators a certain minimum flexibility requirement, but then the additional one is really to provide additional flexibility to that. And just wanted to highlight that also California is facing a problem with bringing in energy storage for ancillary services for the same reason, because the policy wouldn't let the California system operator to make changes to the rules. So it is again moving from the policy level to the rule level. It is causing problems in that region.
Yeah, and I honestly would not jump in front of a developer who's trying to develop low-cost solar and wind and doesn't want to be required to add storage. I think it is much smarter to have storage be an asset to the grid writ large rather than to a specific project. I just feel like that way everybody will be able to take advantage of it instead of having to ensure that it's always co-located. So I think you have to be really careful about putting those kind of policies in place.
Yep. I think it's in terms of the way that the regulation in Mexico is defined, it creates a space to where storage can participate in the markets as a generator, essentially, and it can buy energy. So there's that definition. A lot of what's going to happen is going to be defined in the rules and how those are defined. But, for example, the separation between sort of this more like a participant as a generator and this somebody in transmission distribution create some challenges, essentially, because batteries can provide a lot of services, right? So, I mean, you could be providing services to transmission and distribution, but then that also creates certain issues in terms of the regulator, in terms of maybe somebody taking too much market power, essentially, by taking those types of positions and being able to play both games. So, it's definitely something challenging, and one has to consider that batteries. You can provide so many services with batteries, essentially. You can use it at one moment if it makes sense to shift energy. You can shift load. You can do frequency regulation. You can do a lot of stuff. So how do you define a framework for that? That is something that is challenging to do and definitely interesting to take advantage of the potential for batteries. How can you share it, essentially, in the best way possible to provide services to the grid?
Okay. One more question. Okay. So that's it. So right now, I only would like to read very brief conclusions for this panel. So the first thing is like, I totally agree with the point of view that storage devices should be seen more as a beacon rather than as a holy grail. And also I totally agree with Don in the sense that there's no total benefit in being in one end or the other. For example, one Megatron 2000 battery or every home with their own storage device. I think we have to be in between, right? I also have some concerns about not defining specific technologies. I would prefer defining specific needs for the system and let the technologies compete. For example, that raises the question, what's the better or a fair manner to compete? Of course, I also believe that it's going to be very important to recognize attributes from different technologies. For example, for primary frequency regulation, we have to acknowledge that speed and precision are an asset. And right now I'm thinking something about performance payment, something like that, and also to include those in the policy. And now I think I have a stronger belief that as a regulator, our main role is to provide certainty. I also understand that for a private investor, they have many assets, but I think the most valuable asset they would like to have is certainty, clarity on the rules, what things they can do within the regulation, and how are they going to be paid. So I reassure you that Mexico is open to the dialogue for energy storage devices deployment. It's so open that we already have it in the law. Perhaps it's not the best definition, but as you mentioned, well, it's not perfect right now, but we can work on future updates for making it more suitable for the needs of the system. So I appreciate your time today for being here with us with this fruitful discussion. I would like to give our panelists a huge round of applause, please.